What happens when an 8-year-old girl asks Donald Trump the one question adults often fear to face? The result is a deeply emotional tale of faith, loss, and redemption that left everyone in the room in awe. Stay tuned as we explore how a simple question unearthed raw truths and inspired an entire crowd. The church hall in the small town of Ashford, Georgia, was a hum of quiet excitement. Folding chairs scraped against the polished floor, and whispered conversations filled the air as residents gathered to hear from Donald Trump. Known for his larger-than-life persona, Trump was the last person anyone expected to see in their modest community center. Yet there he stood, framed by the simple wooden podium at the front of the room, an unexpected guest in the heart of the Bible Belt. Families, retirees, and curious locals had packed the room, their attention fixed on him as he spoke. Trump's signature hand gestures and unmistakable orange-tinged complexion were familiar to all. But tonight his tone carried a gravitas that wasn't typical of his usual public appearances. Maybe it was the intimacy of the small space, or perhaps the weight of the questions he knew would follow. Among the crowd sat 9-year-old Emily, a petite girl with dark curls and a resolute expression. She clutched a weathered Bible against her chest, a cherished heirloom passed down from her grandfather, who had once been a pastor in their town. Her mother, seated beside her, leaned down to whisper, "If you want to ask, now's your chance. Be brave, sweetheart." Emily nodded, her heart pounding. She had practiced her question endlessly, scribbling it in the margins of her school notebook and rehearsing it in front of her mirror. It wasn't just curiosity driving her. It was something deeper, a longing to understand the world's complexities in a way her young mind could barely articulate. Trump's address continued, touching on policies, achievements, and his vision for the country. The audience clapped politely, though the energy lacked the fervor of his massive rallies. Emily's fingers tightened around the Bible as her nerves threatened to take over. Her mother's reassuring hand on her back reminded her of her purpose. When the floor opened for questions, a line of adults quickly formed. They asked about local issues, national policies, and even tossed in a few light-hearted compliments about Trump's tie. Emily hesitated, feeling her courage waver. The line seemed endless, and the weight of the moment pressed down on her. "Go on," her mother urged gently. With trembling legs, Emily rose from her chair, her small frame almost invisible among the standing crowd. As she moved toward the line, the murmurs in the room quieted. People began to notice the young girl clutching an old Bible, her determined expression belying her age. When her turn came, Trump looked down at her from the podium. His sharp gaze softened as he saw the child before him. "What's your question, young lady?" he asked, his voice uncharacteristically gentle. Emily swallowed hard, her heart thundering in her chest. The room seemed to shrink, the hundreds of eyes now focused solely on her. Gripping her Bible so tightly her knuckles turned white, she raised her chin and said, "Mr. Trump, what does God mean to you?" The question hung in the air, heavy and raw. The room, once filled with whispers and fidgeting, fell utterly silent. Trump, a man known for his quick wit and rapid-fire responses, paused. His usual bravado seemed to dissipate as he stared at the girl before him. For a moment, it was as if time had stopped. The murmurs of the crowd, the occasional scrape of a chair, all of it ceased. The sincerity in Emily's voice was disarming, her question piercing through the layers of politics and posturing. Trump's expression changed. His usual confident demeanor gave way to something unexpected, hesitation, even vulnerability. He glanced at the Bible she held, its leather cover worn smooth by generations of hands, and then back at her. "That's a big question," he finally said, his voice quieter than anyone in the room had ever heard it. "And not one I've always been able to answer." The crowd seemed to lean in collectively, drawn to the uncharacteristic rawness in his tone. Even Emily, though nervous, held her ground, her wide eyes locked on his. Trump took a step back from the podium, his hand resting on its edge for support. He looked out over the audience, then back at Emily. "You remind me of someone," he said softly. "Someone I knew a long time ago. Someone who asked me questions I didn't know how to answer back then either." The room buzzed with an almost electric energy, the weight of the moment pulling everyone into its orbit. Emily blinked, her grip on the Bible loosening ever so slightly as Trump continued. "When I was your age," he began, "I didn't know what to think about God. My parents took me to church every Sunday, and I'd sit in the pews staring at the stained glass windows, wondering if God was really listening to me. I'd pray for things, a new toy, a good grade on a test, but sometimes I'd feel like no one was there. It's hard to understand at your age, isn't it?" Emily nodded, her lips pressing together as she fought back the overwhelming emotions rising in her chest. Trump's gaze softened further. "I'll tell you this, though. As I got older, I realized that faith isn't about always getting what you want or understanding why things happen. It's about believing there's a reason, even when you can't see it. It's about trusting that God is there, even when it feels like He's not." His voice faltered for a moment as he glanced back at the Bible in Emily's hands. "You know, I think the world needs more questions like yours," he said. "It's brave to ask something that doesn't have an easy answer, and it's even braver to listen for the truth, no matter how hard it might be to hear." The crowd was captivated, their eyes darting between Trump and the young girl who had silenced the room. Emily's question had shifted the tone of the entire evening, transforming it from a routine town hall into something deeply personal. As Trump's words settled into the hearts of everyone present, Emily stood a little taller. The weight of her question had been matched by the sincerity of his answer, and in that moment, the room seemed to breathe as one. Trump paused for a moment, his hand lightly tapping the edge of the podium. His gaze swept the room, then returned to Emily. It was as though her courage had sparked something in him, peeling back the layers of confidence and strategy to reveal a more vulnerable side. The crowd, typically quick to respond with applause or murmurs of approval, remained utterly silent, their collective attention fixed on the conversation unfolding before them. "When I was in my 20s, Trump began, his voice steady but low, "I thought I had life figured out. I was ambitious, driven, and focused on success. But there were moments I didn't talk about much, when I wondered if there was something more, something bigger than all the buildings and businesses I was trying to create." His words were measured, deliberate. For a man known for his brashness, the subdued tone was almost disarming. Emily continued to clutch her Bible, her wide eyes locked on him, waiting for every word. Around her, the audience seemed equally transfixed, leaning forward in their chairs as if afraid to miss a syllable. "There was a time," Trump continued, "when I lost someone very important to me. My older brother, Fred, was one of the kindest people I've ever known. But he struggled, and no matter how much I wanted to help him, I couldn't. When he passed away, I was angry. At him, at myself, and at God. I thought, how could a loving God let something like this happen? Why take someone so good and leave the rest of us behind?" Emily's small frame seemed to shrink slightly under the weight of his words. She hadn't expected the conversation to turn so personal, but there was a raw honesty in Trump's voice that pulled her in. Her mother, seated just behind her, placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Trump looked down briefly, his fingers tightening on the edge of the podium. "For a long time after that, I didn't think much about God. I was too focused on the pain, too caught up in my own questions and doubts. But then, one night, I had this moment. I don't know if it was a dream or a memory, but I saw Fred. He was smiling at me, that big goofy grin he used to have. And I could almost hear him say, 'Don't be angry, Don. You've got work to do.'" The room remained hushed, the faint hum of the air conditioning the only sound cutting through the silence. Trump straightened, his voice gaining strength as he continued. "That moment didn't give me all the answers, but it reminded me of something important. Faith isn't about understanding everything. It's about trusting that even in the worst moments, there's a purpose, a reason to keep going. Emily's grip on her Bible loosened slightly as Trump's words settled over the room. She blinked back tears, her young face reflecting a wisdom far beyond her years. Trump noticed and softened his tone further. "So, Emily," he said, his gaze meeting hers directly, "when you ask me what God means to me, I'll tell you this. He's the one who gives us hope when it feels like there's none. He's the reason we keep climbing, even when it feels like the ladder is going to break. And he's the reminder that no matter how many times we fall, we're not done yet." The weight of his answer seemed to ripple through the audience, sparking a collective murmur that quickly quieted as everyone absorbed what had just unfolded. Emily's lips parted, as though she wanted to say something, but no words came. Instead, she nodded, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. From the back of the room, a man's voice broke the silence. "Mr. Trump," he called, standing slowly. He was a burly man in his 50s, with calloused hands and a rugged face that spoke of a life spent working hard. "What you just said, it makes me wonder. Do you think most of us are too afraid to admit we're struggling with our faith?" Trump turned to him, his expression thoughtful. "You know," he began, his voice steady but reflective, "I think a lot of people are. It's hard to admit when we're not as strong as we want others to believe. But that's the thing about faith. It's not about being perfect. It's about trying, even when you're not sure you have the strength to keep going." The man nodded, his expression softening as he sat back down. Around the room, people exchanged glances, their faces reflecting a mix of understanding and introspection. It was clear that Emily's question had opened a door, not just for Trump, but for everyone in the room. Emily shifted in her spot, her young voice cutting through the quiet. "My grandpa used to say that faith is like planting seeds," she said, her words steady despite the emotion in her tone. "You don't always see them grow right away, but you have to believe they will." Trump smiled, a genuine expression that seemed to lighten the room. "Your grandpa was a wise man," he said, "and he was right. Faith is a seed. It doesn't always sprout the way we expect, but that doesn't mean it's not growing." The room seemed to breathe as one, the tension melting away into something softer, more hopeful. What had started as a structured town hall had transformed into a deeply personal reflection on faith, resilience, and the courage it takes to face life's uncertainties. Trump turned back to Emily, his tone firm but kind. "You did something very brave tonight," he said. "You asked a question that made all of us think about what really matters. Don't ever lose that courage, Emily. It's a gift." As the room erupted in quiet applause, Emily's mother leaned down to whisper in her ear, her voice thick with emotion. "You made your grandpa proud tonight, sweetheart," she said. Emily nodded, her small frame radiating a quiet strength as she clutched her Bible closer. The moment lingered, the air in the room thick with unspoken connection. For Emily, for Trump, and for everyone present, it was clear that the evening's events would leave an indelible mark, a reminder that sometimes the simplest questions lead to the most profound answers. As the applause subsided, the room settled into a hushed stillness, the kind that follows a shared moment of profound connection. Emily remained at the front, her small frame a poignant reminder of the courage it had taken to speak her heart. Donald Trump, still standing at the podium, took a slow breath, his expression thoughtful. The evening had taken an unexpected turn, one that even he seemed to be processing in real time. The rugged man who had spoken earlier leaned over to whisper something to the woman next to him, his voice inaudible but his face reflective. The audience was no longer just a crowd at a town hall. They were a gathering of individuals sharing an unspoken understanding. Trump, sensing the weight of the moment, stepped slightly away from the podium, his gaze sweeping over the faces before him. "You know," he began, his voice steady but softer than usual, "this little girl reminded me of something tonight. Something I think we all need to hear. Faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about asking the questions, even when they're hard, especially when they're hard." The room stirred, a ripple of murmurs running through the audience. Emily, standing at the edge of the stage, glanced up at her mother, who gave her an encouraging nod. With newfound confidence, Emily spoke again, her voice clear despite its softness. "Mr. Trump," she said, her words deliberate, "do you think God gets mad at us when we're angry at him?" The question hung in the air, the weight of it palpable. Around the room, heads turned toward Trump, waiting for his response. It wasn't the kind of question that could be answered with rhetoric or platitudes. It demanded honesty, vulnerability, and depth. Trump's gaze softened as he looked at her, his expression contemplative. "That's a tough question, Emily," he admitted. "But I don't think God gets mad at us for feeling what we feel. Anger, doubt, frustration, those are all part of being human. What matters is that we don't let those feelings close us off from Him. Faith isn't about pretending to have it all together. It's about staying open, even when it's hard." Emily nodded slowly, her small hands gripping the Bible against her chest. Her mother placed a hand on her shoulder, and the room seemed to exhale collectively. Trump, encouraged by the connection he was building, continued. "When my brother passed away," he said, his voice tinged with emotion, "I was angry. I didn't understand why it had to happen, why someone so good had to leave. I carried that anger for a long time. But over the years, I realized something important. That anger didn't mean I didn't have faith. It meant I cared. It meant I was searching for answers." The audience seemed to lean in, their collective focus unwavering. Trump's words, uncharacteristically introspective, resonated with many in the room. For some, it was a reminder of their own struggles with faith. For others, it was a window into a side of Trump they hadn't seen before. From the back of the room, another hand went up. This time, it belonged to an older woman with silver hair pulled back into a neat bun. She stood slowly, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke. "Mr. Trump," she began, her tone steady despite the emotion in her words, "I lost my husband last year. He was my everything, my rock. Since then, I've felt so lost, so angry at God. Do you think it's too late for me to find my faith again?" The question hung in the air, drawing a wave of murmured agreement from those around her. It was a sentiment many in the room seemed to share, but hadn't voiced. Trump nodded thoughtfully, his expression one of understanding. "It's never too late," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "Faith isn't something that disappears forever. Sometimes it feels distant, like it's just out of reach, but it's always there, waiting for us to turn back to it. And when we do, it meets us where we are, not where we think we should be." The woman nodded, tears welling in her eyes. A soft wave of applause rippled through the room, a gesture of solidarity and support. Trump turned back to Emily, his gaze steady. "You see, Emily," he said, "your question tonight didn't just help me. It's helping everyone here. You reminded us that faith isn't about being perfect or having it all figured out. It's about trying. It's about believing that even when things feel broken, there's still a way forward." Emily smiled faintly, her confidence growing with each passing moment. Around the room, the energy shifted once again, moving from introspection to a sense of collective purpose. Strangers exchanged glances, some nodding in agreement, others whispering quietly to one another. A younger man near the front raised his hand hesitantly. "Mr. Trump," he said, "I grew up going to church, but over the years, I kind of lost touch with it all. Listening to you tonight, I feel like I want to reconnect with my faith, but I don't even know where to start." Trump's expression softened as he addressed the man. "The fact that you want to start is what matters," he said. "Faith isn't a straight line. It's a journey. And sometimes the first step is as simple as asking the questions you've been afraid to ask." The man nodded, his shoulders relaxing as though a weight had been lifted. Around him, others seemed to draw strength from the exchange, their faces reflecting a mix of hope and determination. Emily watched the interaction with wide eyes, her small frame radiating quiet pride. Trump turned back to the crowd, his voice taking on a more decisive tone. We live in a world that's always trying to pull us apart, by politics, by opinions, by differences. But faith has the power to bring us together. It reminds us that, no matter how different we are, we're all climbing the same ladder, one step at a time. A wave of applause swelled through the room, this time stronger and more sustained. People stood, clapping not just for Trump, but for the collective moment they were sharing. It was as though Emily's courage had sparked something larger than herself, a ripple effect of connection and reflection. As the applause died down, Trump stepped away from the podium, walking over to Emily. He knelt slightly so that they were at eye level, his expression one of genuine gratitude. "Thank you, Emily," he said, his voice quiet but sincere. "You reminded me and everyone here of what really matters. Don't ever lose that courage." Emily nodded, her small hand extending to shake his. "Thank you, Mr. Trump," she said, her voice steady now, "for answering my question." Trump stood, giving her a faint smile before turning back to wave at the crowd. As he exited the room, the audience lingered, their expressions a mix of introspection and hope. Emily turned to her mother, her voice soft but determined. And so, a single question from a courageous young girl reminded everyone in the room of the power of faith and vulnerability. As Donald Trump left the stage, the message was clear. Sometimes, the most profound moments come from the simplest questions. If this story moved you, let it inspire you to ask your own questions about faith, purpose, and connection, and share them with someone who might need it.